The room fell silent. It was a gray Tuesday morning in Washington, the kind where the sky feels too heavy and even the Capitol seems to breathe slower. But something unusual was about to unfold. Not in a courtroom, not in a protest, but right in the heart of Congress. No one expected what would happen that day. Not the journalists sipping burnt coffee outside the committee room. Not the aides double-checking their notes. And certainly not Merrick Garland, the U.S. Attorney General, a man who had spent decades mastering the law, shaping policy, and walking confidently through the corridors of power. He walked in with the air of someone untouchable, calm, rehearsed, assured. A man whose words had the weight of the law and whose reputation made others hesitate before speaking out. Sitting before the Congressional Oversight Committee, he was ready to defend one of the most controversial proposals in recent memory: the Emergency Enforcement Mandate, a federal response to growing social unrest and mass protests across the country. He wasn't worried. His team had prepped him with legal memos, case law, and talking points polished to perfection. He knew the law, or at least he thought he did. He had defended it before the Supreme Court. But this wasn't the Supreme Court. This was public. This was televised. This was about to become something else entirely. And then, from across the room, Zohran Mamdani entered. Calm, focused. No cameras followed him. No entourage trailed behind. Just a small folder in hand and a fire in his eyes that didn't need volume to be seen. A first-term representative from Queens, a name few in the national press had spoken before that day. But what Garland did not know was that Zohran had spent weeks poring over every clause, every amendment, every case Merrick planned to cite, not with a team of aides, but mostly alone, at night, in silence. Because this wasn't just another policy debate for Zohran. It was personal. He'd seen what these emergency powers meant on the ground. In the neighborhoods where police raids felt like war zones, where families were separated under vague legal pretenses, and where dissent was silenced under the illusion of public safety. This wasn't about theory. This was about truth. And in less than an hour, that truth would shatter the image of America's top legal figure. Has something like this ever happened in your city? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for the next part. You won't believe what Zohran does when the cameras start rolling. The calm before the break. The room buzzed with the usual political choreography. Staffers whispering, paper shuffling, lenses zooming in for emotion. Merrick Garland adjusted his microphone, leaned forward slightly, and opened with the calm cadence of a man used to speaking above others. "We are facing extraordinary circumstances," he began, "and in extraordinary times, the federal government must be empowered to act swiftly and decisively." He spoke of stability, public order, and national security. He quoted court rulings. He referenced the Constitution. On paper, it all sounded reasonable, even unchallengeable. But behind that calm tone was a strategy to justify sweeping emergency powers that would override local authority, increase federal surveillance, and limit public assembly rights. He framed it as a temporary solution, a necessary evil. And for a while it worked. The room nodded. Questions came and went, some soft, some probing, none devastating. Until the chair called on Representative Zohran Mamdani. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He simply looked Garland in the eye and asked, "Sir, are you telling us that in order to protect democracy, you're willing to suspend it?" A few chuckles escaped from the background. Garland smiled faintly. "No, Congressman. I'm saying that democracy must be protected from those who would abuse it." Zohran nodded slowly. Then he opened his folder. "I read the case you cited earlier, ex parte Quirin. Interesting precedent. But you left out the part where the court warns against using national security as a blanket justification for removing constitutional rights." Garland shifted in his seat. His hand touched his pen. "And your interpretation of the Fourth Amendment," Zohran continued, "it doesn't match the actual ruling from Carpenter versus United States. The court was very clear about warrantless surveillance. I have it here if you'd like a refresher." The room tensed. Garland started to reply, "That's a narrow reading of the facts." But Zohran interrupted. Calm, steady, unflinching. Or maybe it's just the reading that doesn't fit your narrative. There was a pause, uncomfortable. Even the air in the room felt heavier. Zohran leaned forward. His voice didn't rise, but the force behind it did. You've told the American people this is about protection. But everything about this law screams control, surveillance, suppression, secrecy. And the worst part? You've dressed it in legal language and hoped no one would look too closely. People looked. Phones came out, cameras focused. And Merrick Garland, the man known for being the calmest in the room, blinked. What do you think? Is safety ever a good excuse to ignore the Constitution? Drop a comment. The law he tried to bury. By now, the room wasn't just listening. They were locked in. Even members of Garland's own party leaned forward, some nervously tapping their pens, others suddenly too quiet. Zohran didn't need theatrics. The words did the work. He reached into his folder again and pulled out a slim, highlighted document. I'd like to direct your attention, he said, holding it up, to Section 4B of the Emergency Enforcement Mandate, the clause your office quietly amended just 2 weeks before this hearing. Garland's face twitched, the smallest sign of recognition, or maybe regret. This section, Zohran continued, allows federal agencies to bypass state-level judicial review in matters deemed urgent to national cohesion. He paused. Congressman, Garland began, you must understand that certain situations require... Zohran didn't let him finish. No, sir. What I understand is that your office redefined the word urgent so vaguely it could mean anything. A protest, a petition, a student rally. You gave the federal government the power to silence it all without ever seeing a judge. The silence in the room was no longer professional. It was personal. Someone whispered, Jesus, under their breath. Garland opened his binder. Papers fluttered. He glanced toward his aides, who suddenly seemed too far away. Zohran, still composed, leaned back slightly. I was raised in Queens. My parents marched for rent control. I grew up believing that freedom to speak, to gather, to resist wasn't optional. It was sacred. He held Garland's gaze. And now I'm sitting across from the man trying to carve exceptions into that freedom, with a pen. A murmur rippled across the chamber. Garland tried again. This provision isn't about suppressing voices. It's about protecting infrastructure, preserving order. Order at what cost? Zohran asked. Do you want history to remember you as the man who kept the trains running by silencing the passengers? There it was, a line no one could ignore. The reporters in the room scribbled faster. The camera lights intensified. Garland looked exposed. Zohran wasn't done. He turned to the committee chair. I formally request this committee submit Section 4B for constitutional review before any vote moves forward. It was bold, audacious, unwritten, but in that moment, necessary. Would you give up a little freedom for a little more order? Or is that a line that should never be crossed? Let me know in the comments. The moment the mask slipped, for a few seconds, Merrick Garland just sat there, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the table, not scanning the room, not flipping pages, just still, as if replaying the last 3 minutes in his head. Then he looked up, and something had changed. The polished calm was gone. The lawyerly tone, replaced by something sharper, defensive. You're oversimplifying a deeply complex legal framework, he said, voice tight. We're not talking about silencing anyone. We're talking about protecting institutions that keep this country running. Zohran didn't blink. With all due respect, he replied, you're not protecting institutions. You're insulating them from the people they were built to serve. Garland's hands now gripped the edges of the desk. This line of questioning is inflammatory, misleading, and frankly, dangerous, he snapped. The room shifted. That wasn't a rebuttal, that was frustration, and Zohran knew it. If the truth is dangerous, Mr. Garland, he said slowly, then maybe the truth is exactly what this country needs right now. Boom! It wasn't loud, but it echoed like thunder. One of the older members of the committee removed his glasses. A staffer dropped her pen. Reporters locked eyes. Everyone knew. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. This was personal. You are mischaracterizing this legislation, Garland insisted. You are fueling suspicion and paranoia during a time of national vulnerability. Zohran shook his head. I'm reading your words, your edits, your footnotes. If that fuels suspicion, then maybe the problem isn't the reader. Maybe it's the author. That hit hard. Garland's face flushed. His voice dropped an octave. You think your idealism is enough to lead this country through a crisis? Zohran paused. For the first time, the smallest trace of emotion cracked through his voice. I think idealism built this country, and I think fear disguised as leadership is what keeps tearing it apart. Now, the silence wasn't tension. It was respect. Even those who didn't agree with Zohran couldn't look away. And Garland, he sat back, finally realizing this wasn't just another hearing. This was his turning point, one where history would not remember the titles, only the truth. Have you ever felt like someone in power was hiding behind national security to take your rights away? Tell me in the comments. The mistake that changed everything. The temperature in the hearing room hadn't changed, but it felt colder. Merrick Garland adjusted his tie again, as if trying to tighten his composure back into place. Let me be clear, he began, slowly and firmly. We are not proposing the suspension of civil liberties. This mandate simply grants temporary authority to manage destabilizing events that threaten national infrastructure. Zohran waited. He didn't interrupt. He let Garland speak and watched him walk right into it. Garland continued, for example, in the case of Section 9AA, law enforcement would be permitted to conduct preventative detentions in cooperation with federal agencies. And that was it. The room froze. The phrase preventative detentions hit the floor like a dropped weapon. A single whisper came from the press bench. He said it. Zohran slowly opened his folder one last time. His tone never rose, but the weight of what came next felt seismic. I want to be absolutely certain we all heard that correctly, Zohran said. You just acknowledged on record that your proposal includes the legal framework for detaining American citizens before a crime is committed. Did I understand that correctly, Mr. Garland? Garland blinked, visibly trying to recover. Only in extreme cases, where intelligence suggests, so not with probable cause, Zohran cut in. Not with a warrant, not after a judge signs off, just suspicion. I wouldn't phrase it that way, Garland said. No, Zohran replied. But you did. Gasps, audible gasps. A wave of unease swept through the chamber. Zohran didn't stop. He turned to the committee chair again. I move to halt all progression of the emergency enforcement mandate until a full constitutional review is conducted. And I request the Department of Justice provide a public clarification on what Mr. Garland just stated. Garland exhaled. Long, heavy, he looked down. There was no memo that could save this. And then Zohran looked directly at the camera, at America. He didn't smile. He didn't perform. He just told the truth. This country has survived wars, depressions, and divisions because we never allowed fear to rewrite our freedoms. Not on my watch, not now. He closed his folder. His part was done. But what he left behind would echo. Have we crossed a line we can't walk back from? Or is this our wake-up call? I want to hear your thoughts below. The walk that shook Washington. The gavel struck. Recess, the chair announced. But no one moved. No one spoke. The cameras kept rolling, the silence heavy like a storm before thunder. Merrick Garland stood slowly, papers in hand, his expression tight, but empty. Not defeated exactly, just hollow, like the shell of someone who realized too late that a moment had slipped through his fingers. Meanwhile, Zohran Mamdani didn't rush. He stood, closed his folder with care, nodded respectfully to the chair, and turned toward the door. And then it happened. Dozens of reporters followed. A few staffers whispered, others just stared, because it wasn't just about what he said, it was how he walked out, calm, composed, and completely unshaken. Outside, a group of young activists stood behind barricades, watching the live stream on their phones. One of them looked up and gasped, "It's him." They parted instinctively. Cameras turned, phones rose. And Zohran, without breaking stride, passed through the crowd like someone who didn't need to prove anything, because he had already done it. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't tweet. He didn't gloat. But the country was already responding. That night, headlines erupted. Garland crumbles under fire. Preventative detention? Not in our America. Who is Zohran Mamdani? Cable news anchors replayed the clip of Zohran's final words over and over. Commentators from across the spectrum, left, right, center, were stunned not just by what he exposed, but how, because he didn't scream, he didn't insult, he dissected. He held the system accountable, Ohio, with its own words. At a town hall in Ohio, a retired judge said, "It reminded me why I believed in the Constitution to begin with." In a diner in Arkansas, a veteran told a local reporter, "That kid has more courage than most I've seen in 40 years. Even inside Congress, something shifted. Several members quietly began distancing themselves from the mandate. A letter demanding a full legal review gathered 73 signatures in less than 24 hours. And Zohran? He went back to his office. Alone, no celebration, no spotlight, just a man who had done what needed to be done. Because some victories don't come with applause. They come with awakening. Have you ever witnessed a moment where one person's truth changed the direction of an entire conversation? Share your story in the comments. The silence that spoke for a nation. 3 days had passed, but Washington, it was still trembling. In a city where headlines die in hours and attention shifts in minutes, one thing remained fixed: Zohran Mamdani's name. The emergency enforcement mandate, the most sweeping federal power expansion in decades, had been suspended indefinitely, not by protest, not by scandal, but by a man with a folder and a voice that never needed to shout. Across the country, something had cracked open. In courtrooms, law schools, radio stations, senior homes, union halls, people were replaying the moment when Zohran looked one of the most powerful legal figures in America in the eye and simply asked for the truth. But now came the moment that would define what kind of leader he truly was. Could he carry the weight of what he had awakened? It was Monday morning. Fog rested heavy over the Capitol like the breath of history. Inside the oversight hall, every seat was filled. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder. Staffers leaned against walls. Some hadn't slept, but they were all waiting, not for drama, not for scandal. They were waiting for him. When Zohran entered, it wasn't with fanfare. No entourage, no press briefing, just the same quiet stride, the same folder, the same fire behind his eyes. He was no longer just a first-term congressman. He was the one voice in Washington who had not flinched when it mattered. And now he was here to speak again, not to challenge, but to shape. A senior senator cleared her throat. "Congressman Mamdani," she began, her voice aged but respectful, "you've become the conscience of this moment. If you were the one holding the pen, what would you write instead of this emergency mandate?" The room froze. It was the kind of question rarely asked in American politics anymore. What would justice look like if you had the chance to build it? Zohran stood for a moment, quietly absorbing the question. He didn't open his folder. He didn't read from a prepared speech. He just looked around and spoke like someone who had carried this answer inside for years. "When I was 10 years old, my mother got pulled over for a broken taillight. We were just driving home from my piano lesson. She wasn't speeding, she wasn't dangerous, but the officer asked her 4 times if the car was hers. I remember sitting in the back seat, my backpack on my lap, and I remember feeling small. That's when I learned that in America, the law doesn't feel the same for everyone." He paused. You could hear nothing but breath. "So if I were holding the pen, I'd start with that boy in the back seat. I'd ask what would make him feel seen, safe, human. I'd write laws that don't just protect institutions, but protect people from those institutions when they overreach. Because the Constitution wasn't written to guard buildings. It was written to guard us." His voice cracked slightly, not out of weakness, but out of weight. He didn't wipe his eyes, he didn't apologize. He just stood in that truth. Then he did something no one expected. He pulled out a letter, folded in thirds. "May I?" he asked the chair. The chair nodded, barely holding back tears. Zohran unfolded it. This is from a 76-year-old man in Tulsa, Vietnam veteran, sent it to my office 2 nights ago. I don't understand TikTok. I barely understand cable news, but I understand the Constitution. And what I saw in that hearing was someone finally standing up for it. I wore a uniform. You wear a suit. But you served me that day. Don't ever stop. Zohran lowered the page. The room was still, but not in fear, in reverence. He looked out at the room, then directly into the camera. And what he said next wasn't for the committee. It was for all of us. I didn't come to Congress to go viral. I came because I was tired of people being afraid of their own government. Because the law should be a promise, not a threat. And because we've spent too long letting fear do the writing while we just sit and read along. I'm not here to be a star. I'm here to be a steward of decency, of accountability, of the people who never get to sit in these rooms, but feel the weight of what happens inside them every single day. And with that, he sat. No grand finale, no applause line, just truth, left there like a seed. That night, the footage aired on every major network. Clips spread across the internet like wildfire. Law professors wept in interviews. Retired civil rights leaders called him a bridge between past battles and future victories. In nursing homes, veterans wiped their eyes. In high schools, government teachers rewrote their lesson plans. And in homes across America, people who had long stopped believing in politics believed in him. Not because he had all the answers, but because he dared to ask the right questions when it mattered most. Have you ever felt forgotten by the people in power? Have you ever waited for someone to speak up when it seemed like no one ever would? Tell us in the comments. And if you believe in truth spoken calmly, power challenged boldly, and hope carried quietly, subscribe. Zohran's just getting started.